As someone who's done work as an accessibility consultant for game development studios, one conversation I regularly have with development teams is about the topic of who accessibility accommodations are being designed to support, and whether the way a design element is being considered could be limiting who it could benefit. Obviously, when video game accessibility is being discussed, the first target demographics discussed are people with disabilities. A common starting point is broad but common disability categories, such as designing for players with motor, vision and hearing-based disabilities. Then we might get a little more specific, covering categories such as people with cognitive disabilities, or specific conditions such as players who are colourblind or prone to motion sickness. Generally speaking, accessibility conversations with regards to video games start at this top end. Accessibility accommodations are discussed in terms of trying to help users with one specific disability type at a time be able to engage with your game, and discussing which end users you feel you're able to take reasonable steps to support. However, once you get past these initial discussions, that's where we start getting into conversations about groups that accessibility accommodations can support, who are not traditionally considered disabled. Recently, Alana Pierce, a content creator and writer at Sony Santa Monica, published a video that caught some flack from parts of the internet. In it, she discussed the idea that adding a pause button to Elden Ring would be beneficial and a potential accessibility accommodation for a parent with a young child, because they would be unable to play games that punish death and lack a pause button, because they may need to stop playing with little to no notice to keep their child safe. She referred to this as a situational disability, a term which may not be familiar to people outside of accessibility research circles, and one that I want to talk about a little bit today, in the context of the social model of disability. The social model of disability, a term coined by disability rights activists in the late 20th century, is a view of disability that centres the idea that primarily disability is about the external barriers a person faces between themselves and interacting with society, rather than something broken in the person experiencing the barrier. The idea is that, for example, if a person cannot enter a hotel because they use a wheelchair, and the entrance features unavoidable steps, the unavoidable steps are the issue creating the barrier and are the disabling factor we should be focused on fixing. If you have the option of installing either a ramp or an elevator at the entrance of the building, rather than simply looking at the use case of the wheelchair user, the social model of disability would suggest looking at which of those options reduces access barriers for the highest number of users. A ramp is perhaps likely to also remove access barriers for hotel guests with heavy wheeled luggage, who might not feel like they're allowed to use a lift designed for a wheelchair user. A ramp might be the solution that removes barriers most effectively for the greatest number of users. Within that context, we can start to discuss the ideas of temporary and situational disability with a bit of context. A temporary disability is, in the context of accessibility discussions, anything that temporarily or inconsistently impacts your ability to interact with the world. Some examples of this might look like temporary experiences of traditional disabilities, such as a person breaking their arm and not being able to use it due to a cast for a few weeks, or a person with an ear infection temporarily losing hearing in one ear. Most people would not refer to themselves as disabled if temporarily impacted by one of these, but their abilities are limited for that period of time. If the issue is commonly recurring enough, that person might consider their temporary disability as making them disabled, such as a person who gets chronic ear infections on one side and defaults to telling friends to expect their hearing on that side to be worse, and to default to standing and speaking on their more consistently good side. By comparison, situational disability as a term can be used under the social model of disability to talk about access barriers that might not look like traditional disabilities, while being similar in the impacts they have and the accommodations they require. If you're out on a sunny day and due to sunlight glare you can't see your phone screen, a high contrast screen option might make it easier for you to see what you're doing. If you've got a young child, a car park might offer parent and child parking spaces to reduce the risks involved in having a child in proximity to moving vehicles more than necessary. If your hands are wet after coming in from the rain, you might struggle to open a jar lid, and you might benefit from tools designed to help disabled people with low grip strength. You are not disabled under the medical model of disability, but at that moment you have a situational disability which could be alleviated by accessibility accommodations, whether they were designed with you in mind or not. While temporary and situational disabilities are sometimes separated out this way, temporary physical changes to a person compared to situational or environmental factors causing impairment, there's room for debate as to where the dividing line is drawn. Using Microsoft's accessibility guidelines as an example, you might see a heavy regional accent labelled as a situational disability. in that it makes it hard for people to understand you when you travel to certain locations. But a person whose mouth is numb after dentistry might be referred to as a temporary disability, because it's a temporary change to the person rather than a barrier caused by the situation the person is temporarily in. The person with a numbed mouth is temporarily disabled, in that they're temporarily going to face barriers regardless of context. The person with the heavy accent experiences situational disability only in the specific context of travelling to a place where their accent is not commonly understood. To use another example being taken out of context by people from the Microsoft example sheet, if your mobile app requires solving an audio capture to sign in, a deaf person and a bartender at a loud concert will face similar accessibility barriers, despite one experiencing a permanent and one a situational disability. Both could be served by the same accessibility consideration. Making sure that there's a non-audio way to engage with the app helps both users. Microsoft is not calling bartenders in general disabled, any more than Alana was calling parents in general disabled. Both groups, in certain situations, experience accessibility barriers which line up with those of permanent disabilities and could be helped by similar accessibility tools. Now, under the social model of disability, we can start looking a bit more broadly at situational disabilities as anything that might pose a temporary or inconsistent barrier for someone, which could be assisted by accessible design or settings options and is a product of outside factors. If we look at the example that Alana gave, Elden Ring lacking pause functionality, under the lens of the social model of disability, we can talk about the accessibility impacts of that decision more broadly. The lack of a pause button impacts anyone who cannot guarantee they won't need to suddenly and without warning walk away from playing the game. That might include people with a permanent medical disability such as IBS, who may with little warning need to use the bathroom, but it would equally impact a parent with a young child who might need to suddenly and without warning help that child get to the bathroom. This is a situational disability where the barrier present is the same regardless of whether the person facing that barrier is doing so because of a permanent medical issue or a temporary situational barrier. In this situation, their accessibility needs are comparable. A person saying they're experiencing a situational disability in that context isn't saying that having a child is a disability under the medical model. They're not trying to argue that having a child means they should have access to all accommodations designed for disabled people at all times. It's an acknowledgement that, in the context of accessibility, there is a situational factor, which means accessibility accommodations would also benefit their use case at that moment. Now, why is this important? Well, for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it means that we don't overlook people whose use cases we might be able to support, and secondly, because it helps us to advocate for these features being implemented based on them helping a wider net of potential players. Conversations about accessibility shouldn't need to focus on numbers of people impacted. A small group of disabled people being supported by a feature would in a just world be enough to justify its implementation, but that's not the reality we live in today. By being able to highlight that an accessibility feature supports people who would not consider themselves disabled, but who face barriers caused by social, model, situational, or temporary disabilities, it helps to make the case that these features are useful to a wide range of people with equally valid needs. It's not dismissing the unique struggles of people with disabilities, but it is acknowledging and normalizing that accessibility accommodations support everyone, not just those with traditional disabilities. If your game features a one-handed control scheme, that's useful both for the person with an amputated arm, the person with one arm in a cast, and equally for a parent holding their child and trying to rock them to sleep at 2 a.m, who's trying to keep themselves entertained while exhausted. That's a permanent, temporary, and situational disability use case being accommodated. A game offering mono audio helps people permanently deaf in one ear, someone whose ears are prone to getting water trapped in them, causing temporary hearing loss on one side, or just someone whose headphones broke on the train home, who can only hear through one side due to that tech issue. Reduced dynamic range, making a game's volume more consistent, could be helpful for an autistic player trying to avoid sensory overwhelm, or someone playing games quietly trying not to wake a sleeping partner with a volume spike, or a person who's been working in a nursery all day who is experiencing situational sensory overwhelm from environmental factors. When designing accessibility accommodations, it's really important that we look at them in a three-dimensional way. High contrast mode, for example, in games is often portrayed as being a feature designed to help low-vision gamers, but it's also helpful for gamers with disabilities such as ADHD, who might find it aids focus, and gamers with cognitive disabilities who value additional information clarity, or someone who's playing a game being streamed over the internet to their phone who benefits in this specific use case because the bright colours help make sense of the game on a smaller than usual screen with bitrate issues. While it's valid to have a target user in mind when developing an accessibility feature, it's important to think through who else the feature might be able to benefit, and often that list will include people who you wouldn't traditionally consider disabled, but who are impacted by situational disabilities externally while trying to play. While I understand that hearing being a parent being referred to as a situational disability might sound unusual without background context, there is a specific meaning to the term. It's not used to suggest that someone who has an amputated arm and someone holding a newborn in one arm face all of the same barriers throughout their life, just that in the specific context of providing them accessibility support, both are groups who might well benefit from the same accessibility accommodations for very similar reasons. It's a term designed to help accessibility professionals keep in mind use cases for accessibility that they might be missing due to preconceptions of who accessibility is for. It's a term that's there to help people who don't consider themselves disabled to recognise that there are accessibility accommodations which might regardless be useful for them. As a disabled person myself, I have no objection to the term and have used it professionally, but I'm not an authority on the subject. It's the term that's currently being used, and it serves a purpose to quickly act as shorthand for a specific accessibility use case. While I understand those hearing it out of context may feel like it does a disservice to people with permanent disabilities, I also think that the context it exists in is important. This isn't a term being used broadly, it's a niche-specific term you're unlikely to hear outside of very specific design discussion contexts. Designing accessibility accommodations with situational disabilities in mind is important. Yes, that does mean that people who are not traditionally considered disabled should sometimes be part of accessibility considerations. It's not taking anything away. Disabled people are still the primary focus of accessibility efforts, but we can additionally design for people whose circumstances lead to the same end results in terms of reduced ability to engage with a game. Thank you so much to this month's Patreon backers who help make this show possible. You can support the show and everything I do at patreon.com/LauraKBuzz.